Gojo Satoru is one of the most broken and hacked characters in new gen manga, and because of how complex his abilities can be, I've been asked on numerous occasions to break his abilities down and explain them in the most accessible, simple way possible. So in this video, I'll be breaking down every technique that Gojo Satoru has, so that you can fully understand just how broken he really is. The Mukigen, otherwise known as the Limitless, is an inherited technique that comes from the Gojo family. When combined with the Six Eyes, something that we'll talk about later in the video, you get a combination of abilities that leads to spatial manipulation on a massive scale. This is technically done by bringing the concept of infinity into reality and manipulating it, but all that does in practice is allow Gojo to warp space in many ways that he sees fit. With the Limitless, he has the power to stop, attract, push, and negate. The power to stop is Gojo's most basic and generally used ability, that being infinity. Now, saying that infinity is the power to stop is somewhat misleading because rather than truly halting the movements of his opponents outright, the distance created by infinity has them slow down to such a degree that they might as well be stopped. Gojo makes this distinction in chapter 14, but this distinction really only exists in concept because in practice his opponent is basically halted. Now there are two ways to explain infinity in its totality, one being the extremely specific mathematical description which Gege tries to give us in this series numerous times, and the other is the simplified version that will cover your bases for the most part. If you are just trying to get the gist of what infinity can do, all you need to know is that this ability allows Gojo to create an infinite amount of space between himself and any given object or person in order to essentially become untouchable. Unless attacked by very specific abilities in Jujutsu like domain expansions or certain cursed tools, Gojo cannot be touched or harmed by anything. In Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 0, it is stated that he is able to manipulate space on an atomic level, meaning that any attack larger than an atom itself can be targeted and warded off by the Limitless. This also technically means that subatomic particles like light can get through Gojo's infinity in theory, which makes sense because Gojo is able to see. We don't know if light-based curse techniques would be able to bypass his defenses, however there is an argument for this being possible based on the description of his control over space. Now, before Gojo's awakening, he had to consciously activate and deactivate infinity, leaving him open to surprise attacks or someone blitzing him before he could activate his curse technique. But after his awakening and a year of training, Gojo was able to automate his use of the Limitless and keep his defenses running at all times. Gojo can determine whether or not something will be stopped by his technique based on its speed, mass, shape, and intensity of curse energy, essentially meaning that if something has the potential to harm him, it will be automatically stopped by his technique without his input. We know that Gojo can take his infinity down intentionally, and he does so whenever he embraces his students or otherwise does something that requires physical contact. In chapter 76 of the manga, he does mention that he can't distinguish poisonous objects, likely because of their complexity and variety, but it's implied that he's gained significantly more mastery over his technique since then, so while it hasn't been outright stated so far, I think it's fair to assume that he is able to filter out poisons as well. If all of that was a little bit of an info dump for you, let me quickly summarize the infinity. If you don't have a domain expansion, domain amplification, specific curse tool, or subatomic attacks, you aren't hitting Gojo when this technique is activated, point blank, period. The scientific and mathematical complexities of this technique could be described as the Achilles paradox brought to life. This paradox states that one can never truly arrive at their end destination because they will be stuck traveling in intervals of that distance for eternity. Obviously, this paradox doesn't actually exist in reality, nor does it usually exist in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. You and I, or even someone like Jogo, can get up and touch a door in front of us right now, because this paradox only exists, typically at least, in theory. However, the Limitless allows Gojo to take this thing that only exists conceptually and actually bring it into the real world and apply it strictly to himself. If you want to think about it a little bit simply, Gojo is essentially able to take 1 inch of space as a barrier and put it in front of himself. Now that 1 inch would usually be traversable by someone who can just move 1 inch in terms of distance. His technique allows him to split that 1 inch barrier into 2 half-inch barriers. He then splits those barriers into fourths. He splits the fourths into eighths, the eighths into 16ths, and continues to do this ad infinitum. This allows Gojo to take a very finite amount of space and split it into an infinite amount of distance that his opponents can never cross, or in layman's terms, he can't be touched. Now, the range of his infinity can be expanded, as we've seen in examples in his fights with special grade cursed spirits, and he also may be able to use the infinity to hover over objects simply by projecting his barrier in a very large radius. The second application of the limitless is blue, the power to attract. Just like with infinity, Gojo is able to manipulate space by bringing impossible concepts into reality and manipulating them. However, with blue, I think explaining what exactly he is doing, even downright to the science, is simpler than explaining infinity. Gojo is able to create negative distance in his world, and because the laws of physics require there to be balance, that gap in reality is very forcefully filled, and this creates a violent magnetic effect. I've explained this ability in the past as having a similar effect to being sucked into outer space, and while it's somewhat accurate, I think I have a way to explain it that is even more apt. Blue basically forces a break in reality that is corrected by that very reality in an instant. For a split second, Gojo's manipulation of space brings to life a thing that can simply not exist: negative distance. What causes the violent pulling effect that we see in the series is not the result of the negative distance itself, it's a result of that impossibility being filled by normal reality. In order to balance or fix what Gojo broke, space has to bend and contort itself until that negative space is filled, and it drags everything in reality along with it. Imagine for a second that you drew a dot on the right-hand side of a piece of paper. Blue essentially folds that piece of paper in half and drags the paper with the dot drawn onto it along. You, and every other human in Jujutsu Kaisen, is the dot. Reality is the paper. The result of this is a massive field of Gojo's choosing that has everything around it become attracted. Pre-awakening, Gojo's control over blue was very limited and generally imprecise. We only saw him use it for massive waves of power with a similar effect to a black hole, or to attract a person to a particular coordinate in space. However, after years of refinement and an awakening thanks to his conflict with Toji, Gojo was able to ramp up his spatial manipulation to the next level. Not only can he now use blue within a precision to target and implode specific limbs, but he could also activate multiple spawn points of blue simultaneously, and even gained enough control to give himself a form of teleportation or high-speed movement. You see, Gojo's physical body is really fast on its own, just due to his cursed energy manipulation, but there is something about his level of speed that has always been suspect. Sukuna and Jogo both mention it when fighting him, but Gojo's movements are beyond normal speed. While they aren't able to pin down exactly what it is at that moment, recent chapters of the manga and the assessment of an antagonist in Shibuya make it clear what exactly he is doing. Now, I won't spoil any specifics pertaining to those moments, I will just be using that knowledge to explain the teleportation phenomena. Now, Gojo uses blue for high-speed movement. This much is outright stated, but specifically, he uses blue to compress coordinates of space to make his body arrive at a destination at ungodly speed. It is called instantaneous movement or teleportation in some translations, and it makes a lot of sense to call it that because Gojo isn't necessarily traveling to any point in space when he uses blue for this, at least not in the conventional sense. It's more like he's bringing space to him so that he's already arrived there. If the phrasing of that was a little bit confusing, I'll try to break it down a bit better. The speed of something is determined by the formula distance divided by time. This is why we measure the speed of something in miles per hour, meters per second, or kilometers per hour. We only know how fast something is going because we can calculate how much distance is covered in a certain amount of time. With Gojo, at least when he uses blue, this isn't really the case. You see, what he's doing with the use of his technique is eliminating the distance aspect of the speed formula, making him seemingly just appear anywhere he wants before someone can react to him. Blue literally just cheats speed because he can bend and fold space to his whim and eliminate the need to physically traverse the world, and this fact is what makes him the fastest sorcerer alive. So fast that even characters who would normally be able to keep up with his physical movements are left in the dust when he uses blue to amplify his movement speed. Now, I know that I just unloaded a lot of information at once, so if that was somewhat confusing or just a lot to hear all at the same time, you can simply understand blue as the ability that allows him to teleport and pull things. Now, this pulling motion isn't just limited to simple two-dimensional movement, as Gojo can actually replicate basic telekinetic abilities by spawning multiple points of blue in space to attract things towards his desired point. This technique may not be used as blatantly or constantly as infinity, but just like that application of the limitless, I'm sure you can understand just how busted it is in a world like Jujutsu Kaisen. Red is the curse technique reversal of blue, which essentially means that it produces the exact opposite effect of the technique that I was just explaining. Rather than attract things towards any given point in space, red repels anything it comes into contact with, and that's basically it as far as this technique is concerned. Actually, it really is just a massive rejection of everything that comes near it, and it results in a massive blast of energy. In spite of the technique's simplicity, Gojo is able to use red in a strategic fashion, as when needed he can delay the actual explosive impact of the reversal to catch an opponent off guard, very similar in theory to Yuji's Divergent Fist. In fact, Gojo being able to use red like this is probably why he encouraged Yuji to utilize this ability that is basically a cursed energy bad habit. Despite this, of the explained abilities, red has the least complexity and exploration in the series. Even with the 2 times higher cursed energy output than blue, the reversal technique of the Limitless seems to, ironically enough, be the most limited in its potential functionality. It is the divergent of the Limitless curse technique, but all you need to know about it to truly have a basic understanding is acknowledging that it is a big blast caused by a distortion in space. Purple, however, isn't as simple as red. Now, as the coloring scheme would imply, purple is the combination of red and blue, convergence and divergence of infinity happening simultaneously, motion and reversal, as Gojo says himself. Due to these two impossibilities colliding and coexisting with one another, imaginary mass is created, and a wave of destruction ensues. As you already know if you've seen hidden inventory, the power of purple far exceeds that of red and blue, as it was able to tear through the durability of Toji, in spite of his ability to survive red with minimal damage. Even amongst the Gojo clan, this technique is a well-kept secret, and you can see why when you understand just how destructive an ability it is. Now, while Gojo has minimized the amount of time and signing it takes to activate this technique, if he chooses to go through the entire ritual with his ability, he can supercharge it, allowing him to shoot off a wave of destruction that exists beyond his normal capacity. You can basically think of it as a binding vow similar to Nanami's overtime conceptually. In exchange for being able to launch purple with much more ease and speed, he loses out on some power, but if he decides to lose out on speed and efficiency, he can greatly amp the destructive effects of hollow purple. If Gojo is in a pinch, he also has the ability to create a hollow purple outside of his own body. Since this technique is merely a combination of lapse and reversal, Gojo can, in theory, create multiple spawn points of the technique so long as the combination of these two techniques takes place. This would allow Gojo to surprise any opponent savvy enough to be on the lookout for the technique, and also grant him a significantly larger area of effect than a typical hollow purple. Now, some say that this technique creates an effect similar to existence erasure itself because of its hollow mass, but it's really hard to determine just how true that is due to the context surrounding the technique and its usage in the series. We see characters like Hanami, who have no implications of having a resistance to existence erasure, healing from that attack over time through rather conventional means. This doesn't outright debunk the idea that it does just erase your existence, but it is something that I think should be considered whenever someone is trying to argue for it one way or another. That being said, even if purple truly doesn't just erase anything it touches from existence, it's clear that this technique can rip through just about any and everything in the series, and is by far the strongest application of Gojo's Limitless technique when talking about raw, indisputable force. Now, while the Limitless Curse technique is clearly ridiculously strong and contributes to a massive amount of Gojo's current status as the strongest, this technique could only be utilized to its fullest extent because it was paired with the Six Eyes, an extremely rare ocular technique that the Gojo clan possesses. This technique is so rare, in fact, that two bearers of the Six Eyes can't exist simultaneously. This rarity makes sense when you realize that it is only due to the Six Eyes that Gojo can have complete mastery over the Limitless. This technique gives Gojo enhanced perception and brain processing power, which is what allows him to manipulate the concept of infinity so effectively and precisely. It is due to his eyes that he can even manipulate space down to the atomic level. The Six Eyes also contribute a huge amount to his manipulation of cursed energy, bringing the cost of Jujutsu during any given exchange down to nearly zero. In fact, it's stated that while Yuta Okkotsu has more energy than Gojo, because of Gojo's efficiency, Yuta would still run out of energy before his teacher. And in fact, Gojo in theory, can't run out at all. Now, this isn't completely true because Gojo can technically be forced to a point where his efficiency when using cursed energy is pushed to his limits. But because of how overwhelmingly strong he is relative to the verse, this just wouldn't be possible for a majority of the characters in the series. Now, I've already said that Gojo's perception and processing abilities are enhanced by the sixth eyes, but the degree to which they actually do amp him are pretty insane. For one, we know that Gojo is able to take things that happen in a mere instant and consider all of the possibilities and stimuli for several minutes, at least in his own time. It's basically his own miniature version of speed or flash time, if you're familiar with any speedsters in comic books. He can also see extremely long distances without any trouble, and even with his blindfold on, the fan book says that he can detect cursed energy like a high-resolution camera. Even things without cursed energy can be found by Gojo simply detecting the disturbances in the ambient cursed energy in his environment. This is why, as a child, he could sense Toji's presence even though Toji has no cursed energy and is invisible in just about every other context. His eyes are actually so potent that he has to keep them covered with bandages, blindfolds, and unique sunglasses to limit the strain that he puts on himself. The normal eye coverings that he wears would simply be unusable for anyone without the six eyes because they are completely opaque. If all of that wasn't enough, the six eyes also allows Gojo to automate his technique and use of reverse curse technique, which is something that no one else in the entire series has shown themselves to be able to do consciously. It is through his eyes alone that he has the capacity to constantly refresh his brain with positive energy and always have the limitless technique active and ready to go. The use of the six eyes helps his stamina so much that even as a teenager, before he truly awakened his abilities, Gojo was able to consciously keep up infinity for 3 days straight, a whole 72 hours of being purely vigilant. One can only imagine the limits of his stamina under normal circumstances now. So, to quickly summarize the six eyes abilities for all those who I may have overwhelmed or lost a little bit, the six eyes grant him enhanced perception, enhanced curse energy control, and brain processing power that are all basically unrivaled in the series from what we've seen so far. When all of these abilities are used in tandem, it even allows him to surmise the technique of opponents that he goes up against. Now, this is a common misconception, and even one that I had prior to really doing my research on the six eyes, but the eyes don't technically grant him knowledge of any technique that he witnesses once. But what it does do is give him the proper tools to deduce the rules and limitations of any ability through watching the flow of cursed energy and taking in all of the present information instantly and using his own judgment as a sorcerer. He also was able to recognize someone based on their type of cursed energy, so this just adds another layer of perceptiveness to Gojo with the help of his eyes. That being said, these six eyes don't make him omniscient. If his opponents play their cards right or simply don't present him with enough information to work with, he won't be able to figure out their abilities. And if overwhelmed with enough information, enough confusion, and enough stimuli, even Gojo can make mistakes or make an oversight with something, as we'll see in certain arcs in the series. One of the major drawbacks to the technique as well is that prolonged, unrestricted use of it tires him out rather quickly. Still, it's clear that the six eyes limitless combination makes him what he is today. But that isn't all. Gojo still has Unlimited Void, his domain expansion, and one of the strongest in the entire series. Its sure hit effect is rather straightforward, so luckily for you guys that may have been confused by all of the different physics and mathematical based abilities, this one is actually rather simple. Once you are caught in the domain, you are forcefully inundated with information to the point where it immobilizes you. You are unable to do anything once the technique has taken effect. And from there, Gojo is free to do whatever he wants. It seems that when people are in contact with him, they are free from the effects of the domain, but outside of that, there are no known counters to this domain expansion aside from not getting hit by it. Every second you spend in the domain equals about 2.5 years of information flooding into your brain all at once. So I think you can understand why this sure hit is so effective and why characters are immediately immobilized by it once they are hit. Now, skip to this time code if you want to avoid spoilers for Shibuya, but for all of those who have read the manga, I'm sure you are aware of Gojo pioneering the .2 domain expansion. This allowed him to combine the opening of his domain and deployment of the technique into one step, leaving most opponents unable to react to the domain until it's too late. The only drawback is that any sorcerer with a certain level of power will be able to recover from the shock of the domain expansion after a few minutes. If that wasn't enough, Gojo's domain also can't be countered by the likes of Falling Blossom Emotion due to the complexity of the effect. The opposing cursed energy can't really attack something as nebulous as information, so aside from casting a domain that can rival his, using a potent simple domain, or being able to adapt to all phenomena like Maharaga, you really have no hope of going against Infinite Void and coming out on top. Now, recent information from Gege has made it clear that cursed spirit brains work differently in his domain than human ones, mostly because of their entirely different biology. While this was something only outright stated in his fight with Sukuna, the recovery of all the special grade cursed spirits also somewhat substantiates this idea and acts as the first instance of us being able to really see this in action. This means, at least in theory, that a high enough level cursed spirit will recover from the adverse effects of the domain quicker than a human at that same level. This isn't really much of a weakness for Gojo's domain, and more so it seems to be a small limitation in favor of curses. But when you are going up against a sorcerer who can expand several domains in one day without trouble, that minor advantage becomes very inconsequential. In Shibuya, it's made clear that Gojo is the only known character that can open multiple domains in one day, and he lived up to the hype in regards to this because he was able to just spam them in his fight with Sukuna, on top of managing his cursed energy in other facets of the fight. Simple Domain and Falling Blossom Emotion both proved to be essential in his fight with Sukuna, and while he would typically never be put in a position where he'd actually need to use either of these abilities, he does have these techniques in the back pocket for him to tap into at a moment's notice. These two techniques work the same for Gojo as they do anyone else, albeit at a potentially higher level. His Simple Domain can protect him from the sure hit of an opposing domain expansion, although when faced with a truly refined barrier, it can be stripped away rather quickly. This is where Falling Blossom Emotion comes in. While this ability doesn't outright counter the technique imbued into the barrier in the same way that a simple domain does, it flourishes in situations where the aggressor's domain has a rather straightforward attack. In Gojo's case, having his own curse energy immediately attack Sukuna's slashes allows the damage taken to be lessened. It's not completely negated by any stretch of the word, but he can't turn attacks that would normally be life-threatening into minor inconveniences on his body. These minor inconveniences can be healed by reverse curse technique. Now I know this, along with the other abilities I just talked about, aren't quite as extravagant and obviously powerful as Hollow Purple or Infinite Void, but in this instance I think it's just as useful. You see, healing is an ability that most sorcerers simply can't conjure up, and for a large portion of his life, this was true for Gojo as well. However, after his fight with Toji and his awakening, Gojo was able to tap into this ability and heal himself quite efficiently. Both the anime and manga do a good job of really showing us just how extensive the damage that Toji did is. However, after using RCT, Gojo is as good as new, and in fact, he's able to declare that the only way to have beat him at that point in the story was to cut his head off. This doesn't seem to be a specific limit of RCT for Gojo, but rather a limit that the ability has in general. It's been stated and implied numerous times in the series that if the head is removed from the body or the brain is destroyed, reverse curse technique cannot be activated. Many users of RCT also seem to struggle with filtering out poisons and healing large limbs, and while we haven't seen Gojo attempt to do either of these things for himself, I would assume that he would be able to regenerate wounds that have been poisoned, and if needed, even lost limbs, just due to the fact that he controls cursed energy and positive energy extremely well. That being said, Gojo isn't quite good enough with RCT to heal other people, as that takes an entirely different level of skill and manipulation, but what Gojo can do for himself with this ability isn't half bad. Obviously, as the baseline technique to heal himself from external wounds, cuts, stabs, burns, and all other forms of typical damage can be healed by Gojo, and if he is ever in a situation where he would be bombarded by attacks that he simply can't avoid, he can run reverse curse technique at maximum output continuously to keep his healing factor going. For most sorcerers, this would be impossible to accomplish, but because of the 6 size, he is able to manage his cursed energy properly and combine his RCT usage with other abilities. The continuous usage of positive energy also is what allows Gojo to keep his technique up at all times, at least when paired with the potency and efficiency of the 6 size. By refreshing his brain with a constant source of reverse curse technique, Gojo is able to stay alert and keep his brain from being fried from extraneous curse technique deployment. His personal manipulation of this positive energy is so refined as well that Gojo can even use it to heal his own technique, not his body, but his technique itself. You see, typically after the expansion of a domain, a sorcerer and cursed spirit's technique will burn out and be hard to use. You can think of a domain expansion as overheating a character's curse technique, and as a result, post-domain, they need time to let it cool down. Even Gojo is susceptible to this phenomenon, typically. However, if he uses RCT to heal his innate technique, that he is able to regenerate his abilities much faster than he would be able to otherwise. This means, in layman's terms, that he can get back to full fighting strength significantly faster than the rest of the verse. The only drawback to using reverse curse technique like this is that he also can't heal his body at the same time. And that is every Gojo technique explained as clearly and succinctly as possible. If you enjoyed the video and would like to see this style of video for another character, let me know down in the comment section below, or check out this Explain series where I have talked about numerous different abilities, curse techniques, and ideas within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. And if you want to see more JJ content from me in the future in general, subscribe and hit the bell. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.